Hey guys, Jesse Scott here, aka J Scott G from Summer Channel, Libra Rising Music. I'm doing this tutorial today because I wanted to share something that I had discovered that was pretty cool. I don't know about you, but if you struggle with getting that drum sound that sounds like those big records, I know that I have. I took a couple of weeks just to sort of slow down and focus on drums alone. And through a ton of experimentation and going through a bunch of different plugins and settings, I've come up with a drum bus configuration that is pretty cool and sounds pretty big. Something to point out, though, even though I have some specific plugins and settings that I'll go through and show you, all of this is source dependent. So, obviously I have these examples I'm about to show you here. If you were to change the sounds or really anything, it could change the way that the drum bus responds to it. So I'll go through some of this and I'll explain it as I go. But my point is that this is not just a magic set of plugins and settings that are going to work for everything. You still have to trust your ears. You still have to trust, you still have to know what you're doing, and you have to still, be open to tweaking to get it exactly where you want. And also something to point out is that, these are just drums. So when you start adding musical elements to this, a lot of this could change in ways in order for the sounds to work well with one another. So I have three examples here. I have acoustic drums, I have some synth drums, and I have some house drums like dance drums. And we'll start with the acoustic drums. I'm playing these out of Addictive Drums 2. I'm not a drummer and I don't know how to mic a drum kit, so this is what I use for that until I have drummer come in, and then I probably replace the sounds anyway. But this is a great plugin. If you haven't checked out Addictive Drums 2, here, I'll bring that up here. You should definitely do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this without my, let me group this really quickly. And then I can turn this off, and I'll play you before and after. So here is before. Here's the drums just coming dry out of Addictive Drums. Okay, so here you go. All right, so obviously very flat, not very exciting. So let's turn on our drum bus here and play it one more time. Obviously a huge night and day difference. So let's start with the first one. Let's go back to my drum group here. So the first thing you'll notice, I have these all grouped, and I just do this because it's easy to turn them all off. Usually, to be perfectly honest, I would ungroup them because I like being able to see the meter in between each one to see how much signal is being fed into the next plugin. That's super important. Gain staging, guys, remember. So let's start with the first one. I got a 1073, and this is by Universal Audio, and I like this one. The default is set to 0, right? So there's literally there's no EQ, and it's set to 0. But I actually cranked it up one notch just to overdrive it a little bit, and then I brought the output down, and I just like the way it overdrove the signal. We'll turn it on and off here, and I'll show you the difference. It still sounds good, but I just like that one a little bit better. All right, so the next one we have is the Pultec. Now, I've had Pultecs for forever. Like, I've had these plugins forever, and I've used them, but I've never really used them like I should have been using them. And so I found a really great use for them for my drum bus. And so let me explain what I'm doing here. I've got a little bit of boost at 700 hertz. And I've got a dip at 500. Now, again, just to reiterate, no magic settings for any particular thing. This is just what sounded good with these particular drums. But one thing that I do want to point out is that I've noticed pretty much across the board with drums that there always seems to be a buildup of mid-range frequencies around 500 to 700 hertz, usually at 500. That makes makes drums muddy. And this is really seems to be a really great way to just fix that. Let me show you before and after here. I'll even turn 500 down. All right, you can hear a lot of mid-range there. I'll turn it back up. It just sounds great. So the Pultec, all right, and then after that, I've got the API 2500, which is a very, very famous bus compressor, and we'll play it with and without. And just notice I've got a lot of gain addition here, so you'll hear a pretty big dip in volume when I turn it off. So. But one thing to definitely notice is that it brings those tails up, especially on that snare. So listen again. It's a lot shorter. It's a shorter decay on the snare. All right, and then obviously, you'll have to experiment with different settings, but this is what seemed to work for this particular set of drums. After that, I've got a second compressor, which you're probably wondering, why two compressors? Well, sometimes it just sounds good. So one of my favorite compressors in the world, this is the Empirical Labs Stressor. So excited that UAD and Empirical Labs finally made a deal to get that done, because it's awesome. I just actually sold my hardware units of my two distressors because I just didn't need them anymore. This was perfect. So here's with and without. Again, huge difference. So the Stressor is one of those compressors that pretty much anything you put into it sounds good. It all just depends on what you're going for. To reiterate, if you start adding music to this, some of these settings might change because it may not, obviously the drums sound good by themselves, but what are they going to sound like with music there? So these settings will probably change to some degree, but the point of this tutorial is just a good starting point, to get your drums from flat to exciting. And if you'll notice, if I go through these ratios here, watch what happens. It's just a different sound. So pretty thumpy at 1-to-1. It's hardly any compression or any happening there. All right, so we got that. And then the next one, very important. This is one of my favorite tape plugins. There's a bunch out there. There's the Waves Kramer, and there's, the Ampex UAD. They're all good. But this one just seems to be the most versatile and the most pleasing to me. I like this one a lot. And you'll notice that I'm slamming this pretty hard. Check this out. So one thing that I want to point out here, and this is probably the most important aspect of this and why I use this plugin. Well, first, if you take it off, just notice what happens with the highs and just the overall punch of the sound. It's a lot more digital sounding. Okay, so you can obviously hear the difference there. It just rolls everything off in a nice way. But the most important setting to me is the IPS, right? And that's inches per second. And so if you are familiar with how tape machines work, you'll know that this is a real setting. 30 inches per second goes by on the head, or 15 inches per second. And I like using the 15 inches per second setting because it seems to roll the highs off in a pleasing way. If you've ever had hi-hats or cymbals that are just grating, you just trying to tame them, and you reach for an EQ, but the EQ doesn't seem to work. EQ is not what what you might need. This seems to, at a lower IPS, seems to really tame the highs in a nice way without having to do any EQ on them. I mean, obviously, you might do EQ, but this just, you don't lose the energy, and it doesn't sound nearly as grating to your ears. So super important component of this chain here. After that, excuse me. After that, we have another Slate plugin, which is the virtual channel, which emulates a console input. So I think that these are SSLs. I don't know what this one is. I think that's Neve. But anyway, one of the reasons why I like this is you can drive it in a really interesting way. It's not over the top. I just use a little drive on this here. Sounds good right there. All right. After that, I have a gain stage plugin. Now, just to point out, this tutorial is not DAW specific. I happen to be using Ableton. Most people use Pro Tools or Logic or whatever. It doesn't matter what you use. But this is a gain. I'm attenuating at 12 dB, and the reason for that is because I have an SSL G bus compressor that comes after the Cambridge, and if you'll notice, again, the meter's in between here, right? We're not hitting 0, but we're getting close. But this particular compressor just doesn't seem to do well with loud. Like if you're really maxing it out, this just doesn't respond in a very pleasing way. So usually what I do is before I hit an SSL, I'll do negative 12 dB because it just hits the sweet spot of the SSL compressor. And then I do gain makeup here, but we'll move on to that in a second. So after that, I have a very surgical EQ, which is the UAD Cambridge EQ. And what I do with this is I just take out any resonant spots after this whole chain that I feel are problematic. So what I'll do is I'll make my Q super wide, and I'll show you here in a second, and I'll just sweep through. So watch this. Right there. Very resonant. And then I'll just turn it down a couple of dB. And you could do that, and you could see that I've done that with a few other frequencies here, but you'll have to go through and sweep through. Again, it depends on your source material. With this particular set of drums, these were the problem areas after this entire chain, and we just fixed that by sweeping through and pulling it down a couple of dB. I also have it on type 2, which is just a narrower cut. So let's see. After that, we've got the SSL bus compressor. Now, you'll notice that we've got 1, 2, and then even slamming it through the tape is almost a form of compression. It's pretty much a form of compression. And then we have an SSL. You're like, wow, 4 compressors. Why would you need 4 compressors? Well, it really comes down to with what sounds good. After experimenting with this for about 2 weeks, I just noticed that it worked. It worked. Now, if you look at this, I'm not hitting this compressor very hard at all. Okay, watch. Very light. I am doing a bunch of gain makeup here because I turned it down earlier before it hit it. But I'm hitting this. I have a low ratio. It's at 2 to 1. The attack is 1 millisecond. I mean, it's really not doing a whole lot. But let me show you what happens when I turn it off. Oh, and the gain stage. Let me turn that on so you hear the difference. All right. It just sounds great. Absolutely great. So, okay. So let's recap here. I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to open these all up for you so that you can see what my settings are. And then, obviously, you can copy them if you want. They're probably not going to work, but they might be a good starting point for you. Really the important aspect of this seems to be the particular plugins that I've used and the order that they come in. And I'll show you with the other examples that we have after that it really does seem to work for all different kinds of drum applications. So I'll play it for you. You can kind of see what's happening in each of these plugins. All right. So let's move on to the next example here. I've got some drum machine drums. I think this is coming out of Addictive Drums. They have an electronic drum kit, a couple of old retro kits, and I think this is like a Simmons drum or something, Simmons drum machine. I'll just open this up here so that you can see. What is the kit? Yeah, real machines. Okay, so it's a DMX. Okay. Anyway, let's play this before and after. Here's the same group of plugins that I was using on the acoustic kit. Obviously, they're set very differently, but let's play before. All right, very flat, very boring and uninspiring. And now let's turn this on and watch how beautifully juicy this becomes. And again, what I'll do is I will open up my settings here for you to see. You can see that the settings are different than what we were doing on the acoustic kit. I think I even have a second Pultec here. I do. And the reason why is because I just wanted to boost at 100 because I just felt like the kick was just a little weak. But you also notice that I'm attenuating at 100 too. So there's the MEQ5 Pultec and then there's the EQ P1A. They obviously focus on different frequencies, but one of the cool things about this particular one is that, and I don't think that it was meant to be used this way, but you can boost and attenuate at the same frequency. And engineers have found over the years that sometimes it can produce a pleasant effect. So even though I'm boosting at that frequency, I'm attenuating, but somehow the sound just sounds good. So let's play before and after. The kick drum is just a little less full. And the snare to some degree. Okay, so after that, we've got our just stressor. Then we've got our virtual tape. And I know that these plugins are just all over the screen here. They're probably not fun to look at because they're all over, but you can at least pause this if you need to and see what the settings here. We'll put that there. So here we go. All right. So let's move on to our final example. Now, I have been making, most of my career was dedicated to making dance music. So I am most familiar with the electronic stuff. I've been in the last 5 years, I've been getting more into the organic stuff, which is why I've been experimenting a lot with acoustic drums. It's kind of where my music is taking me, a mix between electronic and acoustic or organic instruments. But here we have an example that's just a house beat or a trance beat or whatever you want to call it. It's all electronic at the end of the day. Or some people call it just all techno. But hey, if that's what you're making, then surprisingly, this chain of plugins still applies to this as well. So let's play before and after. So here's before. And that's just a few little sounds I have in battery here. Here, I'll actually bring it up and show you. It's pretty simple. It's just a kick drum, a couple of claps, and a hi-hat. All right, that's before. Now, it doesn't sound bad, right? But watch what happens when you turn this on. It immediately glues all the sounds together. It sounds like, when you would sample drum loops, how the drum loops always just seem to be, it just sounded like one big flowing sound. Well, that's how you get this, is this type of drum compression or bus compression. It just glues everything together. So here's after. And again, I'll bring up my settings here. And there it is. like magic, the same group of plugins seems to work on all three examples, which to me would indicate that it's an effective chain of plugins that seem to really get the job done. One thing that I do want to point out is that you have to make sure that you take the time to go through and make tweaks. This, like with all three of these examples, each of these took me, I did them in 3 different days, and I set them different ways, just sort of experimenting with what sounded good. Because you have to remember, if you make a change to the Pultec, the very first plugin, it's going to affect the way that the API responds, right? And then all the way down the chain. So what you change here affects what happens here. You got to remember that. So each one affects the next one. You make a change in the API, it affects the way the Stressor works, and so on and so forth. So you always have to make sure that what you're doing plays well with all the other plugins that you're using, and you have to sort of find that balance of what sounds good to your ears, and then driving the next plugin in a way that's going to be pleasing. And sometimes that gets complicated and difficult to do, but with enough practice, you get good at that, and it just becomes second nature, and you learn how all of these plugins respond. Now, it comes to it brings up a new point, and some of you might be asking, well, can I do this with any EQ and compressor? And the easy answer is yes to some degree. But let me extrapolate on that by saying that there's a reason why, like, these are all emulations of famous hardware, right? All of this stuff is, and except for maybe the Cambridge. And I don't know what the Slate's emulated after. But the point is that the Pultec EQ is famous for a reason, because it does a very specific thing, as does the API, as does the Stressor, and so on and so forth, and the SSL. And can you use other plugins? Absolutely. But will you get the same results? Probably not. And that's why the hardware versions of these plugins are, were $2,500 or $3,000, or however much they cost, because they sound great. Now, I'm using a pretty robust UAD system here, so I have a lot of these plugins. They all run off DSP horsepower. So my suggestion to you is, if you want to get this sound, you got to get these plugins, because it does make the difference. To me, I've never been able to get these sounds without using this before, but again, what sounds good is relative to everybody. This is just what I think sounds good to me, and that's why I'm sharing it. So that's pretty much it. Enjoy this. I hope that it works for you. If you have any comments, you can always email me, or you can check out or email me through liberizingmusic.com. I should have some new Summer Channel music out soon. So anyway, hope to hear from you guys. I hope you enjoyed this, and that's it for this one.